with you. Yes, sir.
Well, this morning we are delighted to have Mark with us. He usually is with us, but not speaking. And today we're blessed to have him speak. He is what I would call a compulsive volunteer at the church. He does lots of things. And he volunteers at the places. You'll talk about that. Thanks, Mark.
Thank you. So this is a pretty intimidating group. It's becoming less and less frequent that I find myself in a room with a lot of people older than myself. And knowing the spiritual horsepower that is sitting in these seats, it is a little intimidating. And as I stand behind one of these clear podiums, my first question is always, is my fly up? I did observe a gentleman one time that didn't do that check before he came up here, and it is distracting. So I appreciate your attention today. I was asked by Phyllis a couple weeks ago to come and speak a little bit about the prison ministry that our church has gotten involved in. And I'm a lover of origin stories, so I will eventually get there, but I'm going to take you back pretty far and walk you through what I experienced that led us into this area. It's my experience. Steve Johnson had a different one, and Ray Prubin had a different one, and all of us who got involved in this kind of traveled a separate path, but this was what I experienced. So just before I start, I do want to thank a fair amount of people in this room, because you folks have been watching over Candy and I now for 29 years. And when we first walked into this room, and I would sit in the chair where Virginia is there, except all the chairs were over a little bit, and watch Bob speak and teach when he had hair and wore suits, I realized pretty early on that you folks were the people that literally built this room brick by brick, many of you. And you provided that seat for Candy and I. And it has been such a blessing to get to know so many of you over the years. My first volunteer position was on tech team in the back little room there. And I pushed the advanced button on the slide projector that hung from the ceiling up there that projected the words for the worship songs. So that was my first experience at serving here. But it's just, there's so many neat memories in this room, and I'm sure that all of you have great memories of this room also as a worship center. I want to thank what I refer to as the long-timers. Candy and I call you folks the long-timers. Dwayne and Tootie Vick, and Lois and Wayne Swearingen, Trudy and Don Moore, Donna and Dick Peterson. I know that some of these saints have preceded us into the next life, but we got to know you all, and it's been such a blessing. Barb and Cal Merritt, Ray Richardson, Ethel Hain. I got to meet Ethel Hain when she was alive. What a blessing that was. Jan and Bill Johnson, Kathy and Jean Johnson, Claudia and Ed Harrell, Bill and Debbie Butters. All of these people we would see every week when we came here to church, and it was always such a blessing to be in their presence and to learn from you how to properly worship God. Since my redeployment, and I don't consider myself retired because I don't golf, fish, or hunt, so I have met many more people here by serving in Encompass, and it's been years that I've been wanting to serve this community because of the weight you've carried in our life. And it's a blessing to come here every Wednesday morning and greet you and learn from you and just participate in your lives, go to some of your funerals. It's a profound group. And I think we all feel the weight of that. So I've gotten to meet Phyllis, gotten to meet Anita, and Dick was just convicting me this morning on the way across the parking lot. Jill Kohler, Mary and Randy, Maureen and Gary, Jack and Jim and Bob on the tech team, just new friendships that have developed over the years. What blessings they are. So God richly blessed me for showing up about 28 years ago in the room directly behind us here where you folks used to meet for Bible study. A gentleman by the name of Dr. Greg Borgon was teaching a 3-week series on leaving a godly legacy. And because Candy and I chose not to have children, I had a lot of spare time on my hands. And we had some spare resources because we weren't spending it on children. And I would frequently spend that time and that money on bad things. But this happened to be a day that I made the right decision and showed up here. And at that meeting, I met both Greg Borgond and Dan Jensen. What I didn't realize until about 26 years later is Greg asked Dan to approach me after the third week and asked me out for coffee. And he asked him to mentor me. And for the past 29 years, Dan and I have met most every other week for coffee. And it has been one of the most blessed relationships of my life to sit with Dan, read God's Word, pray for each other. We've done some traveling together. You'll see that a little bit later on. A few weeks after this meeting ended, I called Greg Borgond and asked him out for lunch. And I asked if he would consider leading a group of men in a Bible study. And Greg said no, he wouldn't. But he would consider leading a group of men through a curriculum focused on life transformation. Since I didn't know the difference, I said yes. It took me about a year to get 8 other guys together. And in 1996, we began meeting in Dr. Borgond's home. Over the course of 3 years meeting together, this group of men inspired Greg to formalize the training into what is now known as Heart of a Warrior Ministry. About a year into our gatherings in Greg's home, he brought a guest into our meeting. Greg had hired Erwin McManus as a consultant for Bethel Seminary. Erwin was the senior pastor of Mosaic Church in Los Angeles at the time, and a frequent speaker at Promise Keepers conferences, the Willow Creek Summit, and other evangelical events. Erwin made a huge impression on the 8 of us men in the room that night, and it would be the beginning of another significant relationship. In 1999, Greg took a group of us down to Urban Ventures to meet Art Erickson, on the right up there. Art was the founder and CEO of Urban Ventures at the time. He was and remains a constant source of inspiration for me, and Urban Ventures became one of the earliest partners that Eaglebrook had in urban ministry. Art has worked tirelessly for 50 years to reach people for Christ in South Minneapolis. He convinced companies like Wells Fargo, Abbott Hospital, and Align Health to invest over $1.5 billion along the Lake Street corridor, bringing thousands of jobs along with them. Art taught us that you can turn geography into community, and that life is about relationships. A few weeks after we met Art introduced us to John Turnipseed. John was the head of the Fathering Center at Urban Ventures. He briefly shared his story of a gang leader saved by Jesus. In the mid-1990s, Dan Jensen introduced me to Stan Smith and Don Moore. The 3 of them shared with me their heart for Ethiopia, and Stan and Don quickly became mentors and friends. In September of 2006, we held our second Heart of a Warrior Advance because men don't retreat. It was a weekend event over in Wisconsin, and our keynote speaker that weekend was Erwin McManus. Erwin had just released his 4th book, and we adopted the theme as the title for the event. Pictured here with Greg and Erwin is Ron Hoff, one of the team leads for that event. Ron is a world champion power lifter. It's always nice when your friends show up to help. Dan and Stan and Don served on the prayer team at this event. There were 125 men there. Probably 60 or 70 of them were Eaglebrook guys. A few weeks before the advance, Art Erickson called me and asked if we would scholarship 10 men led by John Turnipseed into this event. I called a friend and he said he could make that happen. They were the only 10 black men at the event. And it was the introduction of the inner city to the suburbans at that weekend. The young man on crutches is Johnny Edwards, one of John Turnipseed's many sons from different mothers. He was known as Little Johnny. He had been the leader of John's old gang many years after John came to Christ. Little Johnny's leg was shot off in an assassination attempt by one of his own gang members in an attempt to take control of the gang. John and little Johnny had not spent time together in over 10 years. The Monday after our event, little Johnny was transported to a prison in Nebraska, as none of the Minnesota prisons were a safe place to put him because there was a contract out on his life. Little Johnny was released in 2016, but is now back in prison for life after participating in the murder of someone in 2017. We get to learn a lot about recidivism as we work in prisons. Other lead team members for this event included Ray Pruben, Scott Sample, Steve Johnson, Mike Johnson, and myself. We thought the highlight of this event would be Erwin's messages. We were about to be astonished. Here you can see Don Moore and his son blocking the view of the people behind them at the worship service that first evening. It's rare that you get a snapshot of a moment in time, and I think most of you have seen this before when Steve was here. But it's just rare that you get a snapshot of moments like these when God is so clearly at work. Saturday night we held a bonfire. This was my idea because I'm a pyromaniac. So we had a PA system set out by the fire so that men could share their testimonies. John Turnipseed got up and started his by saying, "My name is John Turnipseed and 20 of my relatives are incarcerated, 10 for first-degree murder." The Holy Spirit used this statement to inspire Steve Johnson to reach out to John to hear more of his story. Steve came out of his meeting with John inspired to tell John's story in video, so John would have something to show when he spoke to larger groups. Now, Steve was an Emmy award-winning video producer at that time, so when he said, "I want to tell somebody's story in video," he knew what he was talking about. When Steve shared his vision with Ray Pruben, Scott Sample, and I, we determined we needed to set up a nonprofit organization to fund and produce this video. Scott's business partner, Paul Chapin, was inspired to join us, and Five Stone Media was launched. In late 2007, Erwin McManus was in town speaking at a church in Edina. He joined a group of us for dinner after the Saturday evening service and met John Turnipseed for the first time. Within 2 hours, he asked if he and a team of his creative movie makers from Mosaic in Los Angeles could help us make what had morphed into a short film from a documentary. Erwin found us a director, assisted in crafting the script, and showed up with 15 talented young artists in Minneapolis during the summer of 2008. Through other providential circumstances, we were able to hire some seasoned actors for very little compensation because they wanted to be associated with the telling of John's story. Here you can see Steve Johnson and Scott Sample interviewing Erwin during the week of the actual movie shoot, just south of Lake Street. Another one of the amazing coincidences of this shoot is 16 years later, we now have an Eagle Brook viewing group in the women's jail in Hennepin County downtown, in the exact same place we shot the first scenes of this movie. God's providence. The first of what turned out to be 3 short films on John's life was premiered at Urban Ventures in 2008. The second film, appropriately called Second Chances, came out in 2013, 5 years after the first one. We thought we were done after the first one. God had other plans. And the third film, both of these films were filmed out in Los Angeles to save significant amounts of money, was called Legacy and came out in 2014. Also in 2014, another gentleman who wanted to help tell John's stories came forth with the funding to hire a ghostwriter to come up and spend 3 days with John to get his life story down on paper, and we came out with the book Bloodline. I brought several extra copies here. If some of you have not read this, please feel free to come up and grab one. My only request would be when you're done that you share it with someone else that needs to read it. It's an awesome story of God's salvation power. In 2015, we published and released a 12-part curriculum on life transformation written by John Turnipseed titled Lifeblood. This is the video-based curriculum we have taught at Urban Ventures in prisons, reentry facilities, and churches since 2015. I wanted to get you as close to into Stillwater Prison as I could, because in 2014 we were invited to come into Stillwater Correction Facility to teach this course. Former Stillwater Warden John King, who was on the Department of Corrections staff at the time, allowed us to bypass the normal curriculum approval process, saving months of red tape and possible rejection of the program. So another providential act of God. Now this is an aerial view of the prison. The two long areas, I'm going to turn on my laser here because I like my laser. So this area here and this area here are the main housing units. This little circular thing in the red circle down there is the chapel where we do our teaching, where we do our groups, small groups. And this little area over here is the minimum security part of Stillwater Prison. It's like an old schoolhouse. And for a few years prior to COVID, we were able to do Eagle Brook church viewing groups over there. I think some of the first viewing groups we ever had. Now this is the entry into Stillwater Prison. This is the guy in the red patch there is actually standing in the second of the three vestibules you walk through in order to get into the prison general population area. It's a little intimidating at times, and I do kind of enjoy saying I get out of prison twice a month. And I think Candy does wonder sometimes if they will continue to let me out. This is now in the general population area. You can see the bars that the gentleman in the red patch was standing behind there. And the general population, as they move through the prison, are regularly going through metal detectors. It's a dangerous environment, and we're always escorted in and out of here. But you get close to a lot of men who are in there for a lot of bad reasons. And it can get a little, not scary, but you just wonder at times. We just thank the God that He keeps us safe. This is a photo of one of those long buildings. You've got 4 different levels of cells on the left side there. And on occasion, probably once or twice a week, any one of these quadrants can be locked down for some kind of a dangerous situation. So when we go out there, we go out the first and the third Mondays of every week, or every month. When we go out there, we're never sure how many guys are going to be able to show up. Because one of these wings will be on lockdown. We have learned over the last 10 years to be flexible with that, however. Sometimes we'll just have one guy, and we'll be experienced enough now to know that this is God wanting us to spend an hour with that man and dive a little deeper into his story. So it's always very providential the way these things happen. We've been in there and the power's gone out, and 5 minutes later they've come and told us we had to leave. We've gotten out there and they told us they're all on lockdown and we can't even come in. We've gotten in there and sat and waited for 25 minutes and some guy had a heart attack so that they couldn't move anybody to us, so we sat there for 45 minutes and then got escorted out. You just never know what you're going to get when you go in there, which I'm wired that way, so it makes it kind of fun for me. In 2017, one of the existing Five Stone Media board members at the time donated the funds to write, produce, and publish this curriculum for women. Sheila Ray Charles, the singer's daughter, was the moderator on this project. She played the role that John played on the first project. And it's basically stories of 9 women who have had their life turned around by Christ, and they share pieces of their story, and then Sheila Ray kind of moderates, and we teach these concepts all the way through this course. In 2018, Five Stone volunteers began teaching the Women's Lifeblood curriculum at the Minnesota Women's Correctional Facility in Shakopee. And to this date, nearly 100 women have completed the course. In 2022, the Hennepin County Jail leadership invited Five Stone and Eagle Brook into 2 of the 8 jail sections, known as quads, to begin EBC viewing groups on a weekly basis. Now, there's over 300 men in jail downtown Minneapolis at any given time. And jail is very different than prison because these men are in there anywhere from a couple of days. Maybe they came in on a DWI or something and they post bail and get out. Or some of them are there up to over a year because they're awaiting trial and sentencing. So almost every week we have 3 or 4 new guys and maybe a couple of guys that have been there a few times. But it's a very different experience. We're not teaching a class. We have a great big road case that Eagle Brook built for us. Big screen TV pops out and we put in the service and we play the hour service, and sometimes the guys sing and sometimes they don't, and sometimes they have questions and sometimes they don't. This Monday we were in there and I had a Native American guy come in after everybody had left and said, could you pray for me because I'm being sentenced on tomorrow. So Mark Baker, the staff member from downtown Minneapolis, and you can't put hands on him, but you can pray for him. So you just never know what you're going to run into there. In late 2023, Hennepin County Jail leadership expanded our relationship by inviting us to play weekly Eagle Brook services in the women's jail. And this is the room that we do that in. And interesting story here, the lady standing second from the left stood up and started worshiping. I was standing in the back, and all of a sudden she moved out and walked out of the room. And I thought, oh, we lost one. I've never experienced that before. And about 3 minutes later, she walks back in with a roll of toilet paper and wiped her tears and continued worshiping. And then sat down and was very emotional through the rest of the service because this was Jason's message where he was talking to single moms. And most of these messages that I get to see in jail are messages that I really need to hear. I'll hear them 3 or 4 times on the weekend sometimes, and then when we're out in jail. And it's always interesting to see how people react to Jason and John and Ryan and Bob's teaching. It's fascinating to watch them. Last month, Five Stone Media volunteers in Eagle Brook sponsored the distribution of hundreds of half-dozen donut bags to the correctional staff at Stillwater. This is the first time we've ever done anything for the staff. But staffing is a tremendous issue for any state that runs prisons. We hired a food truck that specialized in donuts to make fresh donuts on site. There were hundreds of appreciative staff greeted by our volunteers that day. I was out of town, or I would have shown up for this, but I heard it was a great time. Around 20 years ago, I started saying that I had the spiritual gift of showing up. I liked it better than saying I had the spiritual gift of helps or services. They just didn't sound extravagant enough for me, and I don't have the spiritual gift of tongues or speaking in tongues or translating tongues or leadership or teaching. So I thought that saying showing up sounded a little cuter. About 10 years ago, the phrase became rather popular in Christendom, but people would use it to indicate that God showed up at their event or meeting. And this has always kind of bothered me, because I don't believe God ever shows up. I believe God is already everywhere. And I use a couple of scriptures to try to prove that out. Now, this is my view, and if any of you would like to help me understand the error of my view, I would love to hear it, because I want to be scripturally accurate. But here it says, there is really no place anywhere that man can hide from God. And in the Psalm it says, we can never escape God. And if God is eternal, and God is omnipresent, how can God ever show up? Now, God does reveal himself. He chooses to reveal himself when he decides he wants to. But I've always believed it's us that show up. And we may or may not experience God revealing himself to us in those moments. I believe most people choose to replace the word reveal with show up because it's kind of a Christianese word, and I get that. But I just encourage us all that we cannot forget that God is always indwelling us by his Holy Spirit and surrounds us wherever we may go, whether or not we sense his presence. A few other places I've been blessed to show up in the last several years. In 2015, I was blessed to show up in Ethiopia along with Dan Jensen, Stan Smith, Jim Wilson, and Scott Anderson to celebrate the opening of the Brahanawangal Bible College that Eagle Brook had helped fund, and Dan had so diligently raised funds to construct. This is not the Bierle-Encompass Bible College. This is actually a church in southern Ethiopia. After the ribbon cutting at the ceremony, we went to southern Ethiopia to visit the Oromo people, where Dan had led numerous Eagle Brook teams to build hostels for children so that they could attend school. Pastor Ficado took Stan and I on a side trip to the tiny community of Webb, Ethiopia. And this is the church that our church funded the construction of in Webb. And the road on the left there was what it looked like for 25 miles as we drove from the main highway out to Webb. And as we crested a hill that day, Pastor Ficati turned around and looked at us and he said, "To the ends of the earth." And I promise you, that's as close to the end of the earth as I'm likely ever to get. Now that church, we had worked a project with Brown and Wangel where we would fund the construction materials for these churches and their people would build them. That church had $1,000 of materials to construct it. And I think they built 15 or 20 of them throughout southern Ethiopia. Here are the anchor tenants at that church. The gentleman holding the cross is the evangelist that travels in and out of there frequently. It's almost indescribable to experience something like that. I was incredibly blessed to be along on the trip. Earlier this year, I was blessed to show up inside Faribault Prison for the largest church service in over 50 years at this facility. It was truly a miracle of God that this service even took place. You all played a major role in this as you prayed for us weeks in advance to clear the way, and there were many, many obstacles. Within 2 minutes of entering the prison, I met the warden for the first time, and her statement to those standing around her is, "If I had known that it was going to be this difficult, I never would have approved this." So we were really blessed to be there that day. If you look just over Emily Alexander's head, there I am, and Emily is right there, and she was so courageous to come down and sing in front of 100 incarcerated men. She was really spirit-led as she led worship. She extended the song a couple of times because she could sense God's Spirit moving in this room. And the only other woman that we brought down there out of the 42 people we brought down is Rachel Holvig. Rachel's right here. Now Rachel is responsible for all of the musicians and technical people that work at our church on the weekends. So she's always moving people around, and she is a floor general. It was just terribly impressive to watch her work. Just a few months ago, Candy and I were both blessed to show up for the opening weekend downtown. We reached out to several of our friends, asking them to serve with us downtown for the first few months, while the new campus team, led by our great friend and former campus pastor here, John Taylor, got up and running with local volunteers. We still have a hard time believing that Eaglebrook owns an entire block of downtown Minneapolis, and that we are continuing the work that God began down there over 150 years ago. If you haven't been down there yet, you got to go. And Donna, we're going to get down there in the next couple of weeks, I promise you. We did the same thing at the new Maplewood campus, since it's only 2 minutes from our house. And we've always loved Steve Duty, the new campus pastor there. This was opening weekend at this beautiful location. I would say this is by far the most diverse campus that we have. And once again, God has allowed us to take the baton from LifePoint Church and continue God's work in this neighborhood. Many former members of LifePoint continue to attend and volunteer at Maplewood, thrilled to see their church active and growing again. As I land this plane, I just want to thank you all again for showing up with God over so many years, being the hands and feet of Jesus Christ, as God built his church in White Bear Lake, Lango Lakes, and throughout the Twin Cities and beyond the ends of the earth. I know that you have all sacrificed what you were comfortable with as a church so that God could take this church to where he wanted it to go. One final opportunity for you all to show up. This is a photo as proof of God's favor upon us. This yard is just across Highway 61 in Buffalo towards Bald Eagle Lake. It's like 3 houses in. I drove by it last week and was astounded by its beauty. These are cilia. There's blue ones and white ones. As I drove by today, most of the white ones are gone now, but the blue ones are still blossoming. I've driven by that home hundreds of times over the years, but never in the 1 week that God puts on this display. It's God revealing his creative majesty because he loves us. May God bless you all. May he keep you and hear and answer your prayers, and just understand the gratitude that Candy and I have for the shepherding that you've done in our lives these many years. Thank you.